The knock came at 6 in the morning, 3 hard raps that didn't sound like a neighbor and didn't sound like a mistake. Denise Okafor stood in a courtroom that smelled of floor wax and old paper, watching an 8-year-old boy who had barely spoken a word in 11 months. Caleb sat with his hands flat on his knees, then he moved them. 2 taps, a pause, 1 more. The bailiff near the door straightened without knowing why. And Kilo, the Belgian Malinois everyone in that room had been told was too old and too tired to remember anything at all, rose from the floor like a soldier called to attention. Somewhere in the gallery, a hand tightened on an armrest. That was 6 days from now. On this particular morning, none of it had happened yet. The knock at 6 was just a courier with a clipboard, standing on a chipped concrete step in a town that used to service an army base and now mostly served the people the base left behind. Denise opened the door in a t-shirt with a coffee stain shaped like a comma. The courier didn't meet her eyes. He held out a brown envelope, had her sign a screen with a stylus that skipped twice, and left before she'd finished reading the top line. She stood in the doorway long enough for the cold to get into the apartment. Behind her, in the kitchen, a spoon scraped the bottom of a cereal bowl. Caleb ate the same way every morning, small bites, chewed slow, eyes on the bowl and nowhere else. He was small for 8, all elbows and a cowlick that never sat right, and he had not called anyone Mom or Dad or Aunt Denise in almost a year. He pointed at things, he nodded. Sometimes he hummed 2 notes, low, like a question with no words attached. Denise closed the door with her hip and read the letter standing up, because sitting down felt like giving it permission to be real. Temporary relocation order, 72 hours, a caseworker's name she didn't recognize, and under it, in smaller print, the case number that had been following her since her brother's helicopter went down over a training range 11 months ago and left her, at 34, with a nephew who didn't speak and a guardianship agreement that existed only in the version where Wyatt had said it out loud, instead of putting it on paper. She had moved into this apartment 3 weeks after the funeral, giving up her own 1-bedroom across town because Caleb needed a room with a door that closed and a school within walking distance and a routine that looked, from the outside, close enough to normal that nobody would come asking questions. Apparently someone had asked anyway. Aunt Denise? She hadn't heard him get up. Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway, bowl in both hands, watching her the way he watched everything now, from a distance, even when he was 3 feet away. Nothing, bug. She folded the letter along its old crease so it looked smaller than it was. Paperwork. Boring grown-up stuff. He didn't believe her. She could tell by the way his eyes dropped to the envelope and stayed there a half-second too long. But he carried his bowl to the sink, rinsed it the way she'd taught him, and went to get dressed for school without being told twice, which was its own kind of answer. Denise stood at the sink after he'd gone, both hands braced on the cold rim, and made herself read the letter a second time in case the first reading had lied to her. It hadn't. 72 hours to demonstrate legal standing, or the county would place Caleb in interim care pending review. She read the caseworker's signature at the bottom twice, as if a name alone might tell her something about the person behind it, and found nothing there but ink. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the maple leaves were coming down off the tree Wyatt used to complain about raking. She thought about the promise she'd made him in a hospital hallway that didn't exist yet, in a future he wasn't going to get to see, the promise that if anything ever happened to him, she'd keep the boy safe, no matter what it cost her. She'd meant it the way you mean things you never expect to have to prove. Now the county wanted proof, and she had 72 hours to find some. Denise let Caleb eat his breakfast twice before she brought up school, and even then only because the clock on the microwave had turned into an accusation. She kept her voice light. She'd gotten good at that in 11 months, a voice that sounded like nothing was wrong, worn over a voice that was doing math it didn't want to do. Shoes, she said, then teeth, then we go. Caleb pulled on one shoe, stopped, looked at the second one like it had personally offended him, and kept going anyway. He did that a lot lately, hesitating half a beat before every small decision, as if he were checking with someone who wasn't in the room. She'd asked their doctor about it once. The doctor had used the word processing and grief and given her a pamphlet with a rainbow on it that Caleb had folded into a paper airplane and never flown. She didn't push the pamphlet again after that. At the door, she crouched to fix the top button of his shirt, the one that always slipped its hole no matter how she sewed it. Her knuckles brushed his collarbone. He went still, not flinching still, but the other kind, the kind where a body decides, just for a second, that it's safe enough to stop bracing. He let her finish the button. He didn't pull away first, the way he usually did. It was such a small thing. She thought about it the whole walk to the bus stop, past the boarded-up video store, and the barber who also cut hair for the base families that had mostly moved on by now. Caleb walked with his hand loose in hers, not gripping, just resting there. And she counted that too, the way she'd started counting every small thing that used to be automatic and now felt earned. At the corner by the bus stop, another mother waved and asked how they were holding up. Denise said fine. They were fine, the way you say fine when the actual answer would take longer than either of you has time for. Caleb climbed onto the bus without looking back, which she used to take as a wound and had slowly learned to take as something closer to trust, proof he believed she'd still be standing there in the afternoon. That morning, once the apartment had gone quiet, she finally opened the box. It had sat in the hall closet since the funeral, taped shut, because some things you can carry to the car and into the apartment, but not open, not yet, not until enough time has passed that opening them feels like a choice instead of a wound. Denise sat on the floor with her back against the closet door and cut the tape with a kitchen knife, and for a moment just held it there, unopened, listening to the refrigerator hum in the next room. Wyatt's things, a folded flag she didn't take out, a challenge coin from a unit she couldn't pronounce, a set of dog tags tucked into a side pocket she almost missed, photographs, curling at the corners, and near the bottom, one that stopped her hand. Wyatt in fatigues, younger than she remembered him being able to be, crouched in front of a shepherd puppy with ears too big for its head. Someone had written on the back in Wyatt's terrible handwriting, Kilo, 8W case, gonna be somebody's problem someday. She sat with that photograph a long time, running her thumb along the soft, worn corner, before she heard the front door. Caleb came in the way he always did, quiet, hanging his backpack on the hook by the door without being reminded, shoes lined up neat beside the mat the way she'd taught him, without ever quite meaning to teach a lesson about order in a house that had lost so much of it. He saw her sitting on the floor with the box open and didn't ask what she was doing. He just walked over and sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and looked at the photograph in her hand. Something changed in his face. Not tears. She almost wished it had been tears, because tears she knew how to hold. This was quieter than that. His right hand came up off his knee, unbidden, and made a small motion, two fingers tapping twice against his leg, a beat of stillness, then once more. His lips moved with it, no sound coming out, like he was reading something written only he could see. Caleb? He stopped the second she said his name, hand dropping flat again, his face going still, unreadable. "What was that?" she asked, gentler this time. "The thing with your hand?" He shook his head. "Not I don't know." She'd learned the difference between his shakes by now. This shake meant something private, his, not to be explained. She let it go. She'd learned that too, which doors to knock on and which ones to leave shut until he was ready to open them himself. She put the photo of young Wyatt and younger Kilo on the shelf where Caleb could see it if he wanted to, and put the rest of the box back together, folding the flag's edge square before she set it down, and made dinner, and didn't mention the county's letter once during the meal. Caleb ate slower than usual that night, watching the shelf where the photograph sat propped against a chipped mug, and once, halfway through his plate, his hand twitched against the table, 2 taps, a pause, one more, before he caught himself and pressed it flat again. Denise saw it and said nothing. She was learning that some things had to be allowed to surface in their own time, on their own terms, or they'd go back under and stay there. It was past 8, dishes done, Caleb already in bed, when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize, a 400-something area code that meant county offices. "Miss Okafor?" A woman's voice, brisk, not unkind. "This is Grace Polino, from Child and Family Services. I have your file in front of me. I'd like to come by Thursday morning, if that works, a preliminary visit, before the hearing." Denise sat down at the kitchen table, phone against her ear, and looked at the closed door of Caleb's room, and said yes, because there was no other answer to give. Grace Polino arrived at 9 on Thursday morning, with a laptop bag, a lanyard, and the kind of posture that came from doing a hard job the same careful way every single time. She was maybe 50, silver-threaded through dark hair pulled back tight, and she sat on the edge of Denise's couch like she didn't plan to stay long enough to sink into the cushions. Caleb had been sent to his room with a book he wasn't reading, door left open 6 inches, the way Denise always left it now. Denise had spent 20 minutes that morning deciding what to wear for a conversation that wasn't supposed to matter and mattered more than almost anything had in months, and had settled, in the end, on the same cardigan she always wore, because pretending to be someone else for this woman felt like it would only make things worse. "This is a preliminary conversation," Grace said, opening the laptop on her knees. "Nothing's decided today. I just need to understand the guardianship situation as it stands." "As it stands," Denise repeated, "on paper." Grace didn't look up from the screen. "Your brother's will names you as guardian in the event of his death. That part's solid. What I don't have is anything formal predating his deployment, anything filed while he was still alive, naming you as an emergency contact or temporary custodian. We didn't need paperwork. He was my brother. I understand that." And she did sound like she understood it. That was the strange part, Denise thought later, how much worse it was that Grace wasn't cruel about any of it. She asked her questions in the same even tone, whether the answer would help or hurt, and somehow that made the whole conversation harder to sit through, not easier. It was easier, Denise thought, to be angry at someone who seemed like they wanted to hurt you. Grace clearly didn't, and that left nowhere for the anger to go, except back into her own chest. But the court doesn't work from what people meant, it works from what people filed. Who confirmed that Master Sergeant Torrance authorized you as guardian, informally or otherwise, before he passed. The question hung there. Denise opened her mouth to answer and found she had nothing that would hold up, no signed letter, no witness who would still say it, just a conversation in a parking lot 18 months ago that only 2 people had heard, and one of them was dead. She could still see it if she closed her eyes. Wyatt leaning against his truck the week before he shipped out, saying if anything happens, you've got him, no question, like it was obvious, like the world would agree with him just because he'd said it out loud. She remembered the smell of the parking lot that day, hot asphalt and diesel from the moving trucks lined up along the fence, and how she'd laughed at him for even bringing it up, certain nothing would ever come of it. He said it like it was already decided, she told Grace now, quieter. Like the paperwork would just catch up eventually. Paperwork rarely catches up on its own, Grace said, not unkindly. That's usually the problem. 18 months ago, on a training field 2 states away, the afternoon sun sat low and orange over a row of kennels, and Wyatt Torrance knelt in the dirt in front of a shepherd who wasn't a puppy anymore but wasn't fully grown either, all legs and unfinished confidence. Caleb, 6 years old then, stood a few feet back in a jacket too big for him, watching his father's hands with the kind of attention only children give to things they don't yet understand are important. Somewhere off past the fence, a radio crackled with someone else's training exercise, and dust hung gold in the low light between the kennels. "Watch," Wyatt said, and knocked 2 fingers against his own knee, twice, held a beat, then once more, followed by a whistle so soft it was barely air moving through his teeth. Kilo's ears snapped forward. He rose out of his sit like something had pulled a string through his spine. "That's it," Wyatt said. "That's the only time he does that. Not for treats, not for the trainers, not for anybody who comes asking, just for family." He looked over his shoulder at his son. "You listening, Bug?" Caleb nodded, solemn as a church. "This one's just between us, you, me, and him." Wyatt tapped his own chest. "Only use it if it really matters. If you're scared, or if something's wrong and you need somebody to know it's real, you understand?" "Only if it matters," Caleb repeated, quiet, testing the words in his mouth. "That's my boy." Wyatt ruffled his hair, and Kilo, still standing at rigid attention, licked Caleb's hand once, like he was in on the secret too. Somewhere past the kennel fence, a truck engine turned over, and the sun kept sliding lower, and none of the three of them knew yet how much weight 2 knee taps and a whistle would someday have to carry. Back in the apartment, Grace Malinois' pen was still moving across a legal pad, and the silence had stretched long enough that she finally looked up. "Miss Okafor?" Denise blinked. "Sorry, no, there wasn't anyone. It was just us. Wyatt trusted me. He didn't think he needed to write it down." Grace made a note. Her face didn't change, but something in the set of her shoulders did, the smallest tightening, the look of someone doing a job she didn't enjoy doing today. "I'll be honest with you, that's going to be a gap the court will want addressed. I'm going to have to file this as unresolved guardianship pending review, which means the temporary order stands, but I can request an extension on the timeline, 5 days instead of the original 72 hours, to give you a chance to bring documentation or witnesses to a formal hearing." 5 days, Denise said. "It's not nothing." Grace closed the laptop and stood, smoothing her jacket in a way that looked, for just a second, like she was bracing herself for something too. Use it. She left with a card and a handshake and an expression that looked, for just a moment, like she wished the paperwork said something different than it did. Denise stood at the window and watched her sedan pull out of the lot, tires crunching over gravel that needed repaving, and didn't hear Caleb's door open behind her. Alone in his room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with his back to the wall, Caleb pressed 2 fingers to his knee, twice, held it a moment, then once more. He didn't whistle. He wasn't ready for that yet, not out loud, not where anyone could hear. He just practiced, in case it mattered. Outside his window, the maple tree Wyatt used to complain about raking had gone bare, and somewhere down the block a car door slammed twice, and Caleb kept tapping until his knee had gone a little sore, as if repetition alone might be enough to keep the memory from slipping any further away than it already had. 5 days. Denise wrote the number on a sticky note and put it on the fridge, then took it down an hour later because Caleb kept looking at it like it was a countdown to something worse than school. She spent that first evening at the kitchen table with Wyatt's old address book, the paper kind, spiral-bound and soft at the corners, from being carried in cargo pockets across 3 different postings. Half the numbers were disconnected. One belonged to a pizza place in a town Wyatt hadn't lived in for 6 years. Another rang twice and then delivered a recorded voice telling her the number was no longer in service, and she sat with the phone against her ear a moment longer than she needed to, as if the silence after the recording might still hold an answer. A third number belonged to a woman who answered laughing, mid-conversation with someone else, and had no idea who Wyatt Torrance was at all, a wrong number Wyatt had probably scribbled down at a bar and never crossed out. But near the back, under a tab labeled simply Unit, she found a name she recognized from every story her brother had ever told about the years before Caleb was born, Reyes. She dialed before she could talk herself out of it. It rang 4 times, long enough that she'd begun composing a voicemail in her head, apologetic and rambling, when someone finally picked up. Colonel Foster Reyes. The voice on the other end was gravel and no wasted words, the voice of a man used to being listened to the first time. "Colonel Reyes, my name is Denise Okafor. I'm Wyatt Torrance's sister." There was a pause on the line, not confusion, something else, recognition maybe, or the particular silence of a man doing math about a debt he hadn't paid yet. "Wyatt's sister," Reyes said. "I heard. I'm sorry I didn't call. I should have called. I need your help." She said it plainly, because there wasn't time to be anything but plain. She told him about the letter, about Grace Malinois, about the 5 days and the hearing and the gap in the paperwork that no amount of love could fill on its own. She told him last about the box and the photograph and Caleb's hand tapping 2 beats and a pause against his own knee like it was a language he was afraid to speak out loud. Reyes was quiet long enough that she thought the call had dropped. In the background she could hear what sounded like a door closing, footsteps, a room going quieter around him. "I know that signal," he said finally. "Wyatt built it himself, off book, just for the 2 of them and the dog, never logged it in any training record. Told me once it was the only thing he had that was just his, not the Army's, not the missions, his and the boys'. Where's Kilo now? Retired 18 months back, after Wyatt's unit rotated out." There's a facility about 2 hours from you, Bracken Hollow K9. They take in working dogs coming off active service. I know the man who runs it." A breath, and something in his voice shifted, steadier now, like a man deciding something. "I owe your brother more than I can pay back in one phone call, Miss Okafor, but I can start with this. I'll go to Bracken Hollow myself. I'll bring the training file if I have to fight for it, and I'll bring Kilo, if the court allows it." Denise's hand tightened around the phone. "You'd do that? Your brother pulled 2 of my people out of a building that was on fire on 3 sides. I'm not going to sit at home while his family gets shuffled through a system that's never met him." He said it flat, without any performance in it, the way a man states a fact he's already decided he'll act on. "Give me your address. I'll be in touch tonight." When she hung up, her hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She found Caleb in the hallway, half hidden by the doorframe, clearly having heard some of it, backpack strap still hanging off one shoulder from where he'd frozen mid-motion. "That was someone who knew your dad," she said carefully. "A friend of his. He's going to help us." Caleb didn't move. "He mentioned Kilo," she said. "Do you remember him? The dog?" For the first time in longer than she could count, something moved across her nephew's face that wasn't caution. It was small, barely a flicker at the corner of his mouth, but it was there, unguarded for half a second, before he caught himself and pulled it back in. "Does he remember me?" Caleb asked. 4 words, spoken out loud, clear as a bell, the first full question he'd asked her since the funeral. Denise had to look away for a second before she trusted her own voice. "I don't know, Bug, but we're going to find out." That evening she let him help her make dinner, an old habit they'd let slide these past months, and he stood on the step stool, stirring a pot of pasta with more concentration than the task strictly required, glancing every so often toward the shelf where the photograph sat. Neither of them mentioned it out loud. It felt, somehow, like enough that they were both aware of it in the room with them. Later, over dinner, Caleb asked what a kernel was, and whether Kilo would remember his father's smell, and whether dogs remembered smells the same way people remembered faces. Denise answered as best she could, making up half of it, and he seemed satisfied enough with the not-quite answers, chewing thoughtfully, looking now and then toward the window, as if some part of him were already picturing a 2-hour drive he hadn't yet been told about. After the dishes, he asked if he could see the photograph again, and she took it down from the shelf and set it on the table between them, and he studied it for a long while. The puppy Kilo, the young Wyatt, the low orange light neither of them had ever seen with their own eyes, but which both of them, in different ways, had come to know by heart. "He looks happy there," Caleb said finally, quiet, and Denise agreed that he did, and neither of them added anything more to it. He traced the edge of the photograph once with his fingertip, careful not to smudge it, and handed it back to her like he was returning something borrowed. That night, after he was asleep, she took the photograph off the shelf, young Wyatt, younger Kilo, the sun low and orange behind them, and tucked it into the inside pocket of her purse, where it would be close to hand for whatever came next. It felt less like a keepsake now, and more like evidence, though evidence of what, exactly, she couldn't have said. She lay awake for a long time that night. The radiator ticked in the hallway. She ran the conversation with Reyes over in her head, trying to guess how much of what he'd promised was possible, and how much was simply what a good man says to a grieving family because the alternative is unbearable. She thought, too, about Wyatt, about the version of him that existed only in other people's memories now, the version Reyes had known on deployments she'd never heard the details of, the version who built his son a private signal, the way another father might build a treehouse or teach a fishing knot. She wondered what other pieces of her brother were still out there, held by people she'd never met, waiting for some occasion to surface. She didn't have an answer by the time she finally fell asleep, and when she woke twice in the night, it was with the same sentence circling in her head, "Get him here, however close it is," though she hadn't spoken it yet to anyone. Her phone rang again at 9:40, less than 2 hours after the first call ended. Reyes's number. She answered on the first ring, already smiling, already halfway to believing the worst of the week was behind them. "Colonel." There was a pause before he spoke, and it was the wrong kind of pause, not the one from before, not recognition or resolve. This one had gone tight and careful, the sound of a man choosing words he didn't want to have to say. "Denise," he said, "we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" Denise sat down hard on the edge of the couch, the phone pressed so tight against her ear it hurt. "I called Bracken Hollow to arrange transport," Reyes said. "Talked to the facility director myself. He's refusing to release Kilo from the premises. Says the dog was transferred to the facility's care under a liability agreement when he retired from active duty, categorized as transferred government working asset, pending final disposition. Legally, until that paperwork clears, Kilo isn't a family pet the court can subpoena for a home visit. He's an asset on a ledger, and the director doesn't want to be the one who signs off on moving him without cover. So he's not coming." "I didn't say that. I said it's not simple. I'm going to keep pushing. Colonel, I don't have time for you to keep pushing." She heard her own voice crack down the middle and didn't try to fix it. "The hearing is in 2 days. Reyes didn't have an answer for that, not one that helped, and after a few more minutes of him promising to try again in the morning, the call ended the way bad calls end, too many good intentions and not enough left to hold on to. Denise sat with the dead phone in her lap for a long time, staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like nothing in particular, the kind of shape she'd have made up a story about for Caleb once, back before stories about shapes on the ceiling stopped feeling like the kind of thing they had time for. Then she found the facility's number online and called it herself because doing something felt marginally less unbearable than doing nothing. The man who answered was polite in the specific, practiced way of someone who had given this exact answer before to someone exactly this desperate. "I understand the situation is difficult, ma'am, I do, but I can't authorize an animal's release from this facility on a civilian custody matter without my own legal sign-off, and I don't have that in hand. I'm sorry. He's not an asset, he's the only thing my nephew has left of his father." "I hear you." The man's voice softened without changing its answer. "I really do. I've got dogs here that men cried over when they came to say goodbye, but my hands are tied on my end until something official comes through. I wish I had a different answer for you." She thanked him because there was nothing else productive to do with the anger, and hung up and sat in the dark kitchen with the phone screen going black in her hand, the refrigerator humming its one steady note into the silence. She thought about calling Reyes back, or calling Grace, or calling anyone who might tell her what to do next, and instead just sat there for a long while doing nothing at all, which felt, for once, like its own kind of exhaustion. She thought, too, of every other closed door in her life that had ever looked, for one hopeful minute, like it might open. A scholarship application years ago that came back a rejection 2 days before the deadline for anything else. A boyfriend who promised to stay and left within the month. The years she'd spent trying to get her own younger brother, not Wyatt but the one who came after, into a program that could have kept him out of the trouble that eventually swallowed him whole. She had learned, long before this week, that the world let her hope right up until the last moment, then took it back. She thought about calling her mother, 3 states away, and not well enough to be told any of this yet, and decided against it, the way she'd decided against it every day for 11 months, because some burdens were hers alone to carry, until there was no other way around it. She wondered, not for the first time, whether that instinct to shoulder everything alone was a kind of love or a kind of stubbornness, and whether Wyatt would have told her which. She didn't hear Caleb's door open, she didn't hear his feet on the floor. The first she knew of him was the weight of him settling on the step beside her, out on the front stoop, where she'd gone because the walls of the apartment had started to feel too close, the ceiling too low, the letter on the fridge too loud even from 3 rooms away. She hadn't meant for him to see this. In 11 months she had cried exactly twice, both times in the shower with the water running loud enough to cover it, both times after he was long asleep. She had promised herself, somewhere in that hospital hallway, that whatever else happened, he would never watch her come apart. It had felt like the one thing she could still control. Now here she was, on the front step at 9 at night, tears running down cold and unglamorous, and her nephew sitting beside her, seeing every bit of it, his own breath fogging faintly in the cold air between them. Down the street a porch light buzzed, on the edge of burning out, and somewhere further off a car alarm chirped twice and went quiet. She wiped her face fast, too late to undo anything. "Sorry, Bug, I'm okay." He didn't say anything, he didn't move away either. And then, slow, like he was working up to something that cost him more than she understood, he reached over and put one small hand flat against her shoulder. It was such a small weight, it nearly finished her. "I'm supposed to be the one taking care of you," she said, half a laugh, half something else entirely, wiping at her face again with the back of her wrist. Caleb kept his hand where it was. Then, in a voice she almost didn't recognize because she'd heard it so rarely, whole and unbroken, "I remember what my dad taught me. I think he still remembers it too." Denise turned to look at him. In the porch light, his face had lost the careful blankness he wore like armor most days, just for a moment, just long enough for her to see the boy underneath it, scared and stubborn and still, somehow, hoping. "What did he teach you, Caleb?" He looked down at his own hand, still resting on her shoulder, and for a second she thought he might actually tell her. His jaw worked once, like the words were right there behind his teeth. Then something closed over his face again, not all the way, not like before, just enough to buy himself more time. "Not yet," he said, "but I will." She didn't push. She had learned, across 11 silent months, exactly how much a person could carry before they needed to set part of it down on their own terms, in their own time. She put her arm around him instead, and they sat on the cold step together, watching a neighbor's porch light flicker on and off down the block until neither of them was shaking anymore, 2 days from a hearing that could still take everything, with no plan left except whatever Caleb was carrying and not yet ready to say. Somewhere past the fence line, a dog barked twice at nothing, and Caleb's hand twitched once against her shoulder, and neither of them said a word about it. They stayed out there until the cold finally drove them in, and even then Caleb lingered a moment at the door, looking back up the dark street, as if some part of him expected an answer to come walking up it. Inside, she tucked him into bed and sat on the edge of the mattress a moment longer than usual, smoothing the blanket over his shoulder the way she used to before any of this started, and for once he let her linger there without pulling the blanket up higher to hide behind. She left his door open the usual 6 inches and stood in the hallway afterward, arms crossed against the cold that had followed them in from the step, trying to imagine what tomorrow could possibly bring that would be any kinder than today had been. She did not sleep so much as wait for morning with her eyes closed, going over every version of the next 2 days she could imagine, none of them offering anything close to certainty, all of them ending, one way or another, with a decision made by people who had never once sat on a cold step with Caleb Torrance's hand resting on their shoulder. Ries called back before 8 the next morning, and this time there was something in his voice Denise hadn't heard the night before. Not certainty, exactly, but direction. "I can't make the facility hand him over voluntarily," he said, "but I can get the court to order it. If the judge issues a subpoena treating Kilo as material evidence relevant to the guardianship hearing, not as a pet, as evidence, Bracken Hollow has to comply. It's a different door than the one we tried yesterday. Can you actually get that? I've got a lawyer friend drafting the request this morning. It's not guaranteed, but it's real and it's fast if the judge signs off today." Denise thanked him 3 times before he stopped her and told her to save it for after the hearing, and hung up to go make calls she wouldn't tell her the details of until they'd happened. She spent the rest of the morning at the kitchen table with every piece of paper she owned spread out in front of her: Wyatt's will, his old deployment orders, a photograph, a stack of nothing that added up to something only if you already believed it. By afternoon, her eyes ached from reading the same 3 paragraphs over and over, looking for a loophole that wasn't going to appear no matter how many times she looked. She made coffee she didn't drink and let it go cold at her elbow, and somewhere around 2 o'clock she caught herself reading the same sentence for the 5th time without absorbing a word of it. Outside, the wind picked up enough to rattle the loose pane in the kitchen window, and she got up twice to check on nothing at all, just to move, just to feel like the day was passing forward instead of standing still around her. At one point, she called the school to say Caleb might need to leave early the following day, and the secretary who answered, an older woman who'd known the family since before the funeral, told her gently that whatever it was, they'd all be pulling for them. Denise thanked her and hung up before her voice could betray how close that small kindness had come to undoing her entirely. She also called Reyes's lawyer friend directly, a woman named Priya Nakamura who spoke fast and precisely, and asked Denise to send over every scrap of documentation she had within the hour, promising nothing beyond that she would try. Denise spent 40 minutes photographing pages with her phone at odd angles, the flash bouncing off the kitchen table, and sent them off into the void with no idea whether any of it would matter by morning. Caleb came and sat across from her around 4, school backpack still on, and watched her for a while without speaking. "You don't have to do that," she said, not looking up. "Homework first, remember?" He didn't move toward his backpack. Instead, he reached out and turned one of the papers around so it faced him, Wyatt's handwriting on an old training log, half illegible. "Caleb?" He looked up at her, and something in his jaw was set in a way she'd only seen once before, the night on the step. 2 taps against the table, a held breath. One more, softer this time. "That's it," he said. "That's what I remember. Dad taught it to me and Kilo, on the training field. 2 knee taps, twice. Then a pause, then one more, then a whistle." He demonstrated the shape of it with his lips, but didn't let sound out, not yet, like he was still deciding whether the words alone were safe to say out loud in this kitchen, in daylight, to someone who might not understand what they cost him. He said it was only for family. Only if it really mattered. Denise sat very still, afraid that any sudden movement would make him stop. He said Kilo would know it was real, even if Kilo forgot everything else. Caleb's voice thinned at the edges but didn't break. "I didn't want to say it before. It was ours. Just Dad's and mine and Kilo's. If I told people, it felt like giving it away. And now?" He looked at the papers spread across the table, at the photograph propped against the sugar bowl, at his aunt's tired, hopeful face. "Now I think maybe it matters more if I use it than if I keep it." Denise came around the table and pulled him into her without asking, and for the first time in 11 months he let himself be held all the way, arms coming up around her back instead of staying folded at his sides. "Thank you for telling me," she said into his hair. "Thank you for trusting me with it." They stayed at the table until the light outside went orange and then gray, Caleb helping her organize the papers now, instead of just watching her drown in them, sorting the training logs by date without being asked. The two of them, a team in a way they hadn't quite managed to be before tonight. Not one person protecting another, but 2 people carrying the same weight from opposite ends. She noticed, somewhere around dinner time, that neither of them ate, that he'd started talking again in small ways, asking where a paper went, or telling her a staple was bent. Ordinary sentences that would have gone unnoticed in any other house, and felt, in this one, like a door easing open on its hinges. Once, sorting through a folder, he found a photograph of himself as a toddler on Wyatt's shoulders and held it up without a word, and she took it from him gently and set it aside for later, for a calmer night than this one. Around 9 she made him stop and eat something, a peanut butter sandwich cut on the diagonal the way he liked it, and he ate it standing at the counter, still looking over his shoulder at the papers, as if leaving them alone even for a minute might undo the progress they'd made. They fell asleep like that eventually, slumped against each other at the kitchen table, papers still spread in front of them, the lamp left burning, Kilo's photograph the last thing either of them looked at before their eyes closed. The phone woke them both a little after 6 in the morning. Denise fumbled for it half-blind, heart already hammering before she'd even answered. It was Reyes. The judge had signed the order overnight. Bracken Hollow had no more grounds to refuse. "He's releasing the dog," Reyes said. "I can have him at the courthouse for the hearing, but Denise, it's cutting it close. We've got maybe 3 hours before you're due in front of the judge, and it's a 2-hour drive from here with paperwork on both ends." Denise looked across the table at Caleb, awake now, watching her face for the answer before she'd said a word out loud. "Get him here," she said. "However close it is, get him here." The courtroom was smaller than Denise had pictured it, all those months of dreading this moment, wood benches worn smooth by other families' worst days, and fluorescent light humming faintly overhead. Judge Corwin Prescott sat behind a bench too tall for the room, reading glasses low on his nose, a stack of files in front of him thick enough that Denise's case was clearly one of a dozen he'd hear that morning. Denise had barely slept, and the coffee she'd bought from a gas station on the drive over sat untouched and cold in the cup holder of a courthouse she'd never once imagined she'd have to walk into. Caleb sat beside her in his good shirt, the one with the button that always slipped, hands flat on his knees, eyes fixed on a scuff mark in the floor tile, as if it were the only steady thing left in the room. He worked by procedure, not malice, it was simply the shape of the job. "Miss Okafor, I want to be candid with you," he said, not unkindly, after Grace Polino had laid out the guardianship gap in careful factual language. "The court values the bond between you and your nephew, but I have to make findings based on documentation, and what's in front of me is thin. Absent something more concrete, my inclination is to extend temporary placement while a formal home study is completed, which would mean Caleb transitions to interim care during that process." Denise's hands went cold in her lap. Beside her, Caleb sat rigid, staring at a point on the table in front of him, and she felt him shrink an inch smaller, like he was trying to take up less room in a world that kept deciding things about him without asking. Denise opened her mouth to speak, to argue, to say anything at all, but the bailiff had already begun collecting the paperwork from the clerk's desk, the small mechanical sounds of a decision already treated as settled, and for a moment the whole room seemed to be moving forward without her. She thought, absurdly, of the sandwich she'd cut Caleb that morning, of how small and ordinary the last normal thing they'd done together had been, and how it might soon be the last one for a while. That was when the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Colonel Foster Reyes came through first, tall and gray and still moving like a man 20 years younger, a leather training record binder under one arm. Behind him, a handler Denise didn't recognize led Kilo in on a short lead, and something was wrong immediately, visibly wrong, the kind of wrong that made the whole gallery lean forward at once. Kilo wasn't the dog from the photograph. He was older, grayer around the muzzle, and here, under fluorescent lights that hummed and among the scrape of chairs and the low murmur of strangers, his ears were pinned back and his tail hung low. He balked at the gate, planted his feet, head swinging side to side like he was trying to place a smell he couldn't locate. The handler had to coax him 3 full steps at a time, murmuring something low that didn't seem to reach him at all. Denise felt the hope she'd been carrying for 2 days go thin and brittle in her chest. "Colonel Reyes," Judge Prescott said, not unkindly but not warmly either, checking his watch in a way that told the whole room exactly how much of his morning this was costing him. "I appreciate you making the trip. But I have to say, this animal does not appear to be demonstrating the kind of recognition or bond your affidavit describes. Your Honor, if I might have a moment to settle him, we're already behind schedule." Prescott's gavel sat within reach of his hand, and everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. It was Grace Polino who spoke next, and every head in the courtroom turned, because nobody expected it from her, least of all Denise, who had spent 5 days thinking of her as the person standing between them and everything they wanted. "Your Honor, if the court will permit, I'd ask for 5 minutes before any ruling. I've reviewed this file closely. I don't think what we're seeing is a dog who's forgotten anything. I think it's a room full of strangers and noise he's not used to." Prescott studied her for a moment, glasses low on his nose, weighing a request from the one person in the room whose job was supposed to be arguing for exactly the outcome he'd been leaning toward all morning. 5 minutes, he said finally, and the words landed on the room like a held breath finally let go. "That's what I can give you." Kilo, meanwhile, had stopped pulling against the lead. He stood in the center aisle with his head low, ears still pinned, tail still down, looking like exactly what the judge had said he looked like. An old dog who didn't know why he was here, in a room too loud and too bright to mean anything to him anymore. A bailiff near the door shifted his weight, and even that small sound made Kilo's ears twitch toward it, wary, unmoored. 5 minutes. The gallery had gone dead silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on the back of the neck. Somewhere behind the bench a clock ticked, visible now that no one had anything else to look at. Denise found herself counting the ticks without meaning to. The way you count anything when counting is the only thing left in your control. Reyes crouched near Kilo, one hand resting on his flank, murmuring something too low for the gallery to catch, and the dog's ears flicked toward him without ever really settling. Somewhere in the gallery a chair creaked, and Kilo's whole body flinched toward the sound before sagging low again. 2 minutes gone. Reyes tried the dog's name, low and even, the way a handler is trained to. Kilo's tail gave one weak thump against the floor and went still again. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't the recognition anyone in that room needed to see, and Denise watched Prescott's hand drift, almost absently, back toward the gavel. Grace glanced at her watch, then at the judge, then at the boy beside Denise, as if doing some private arithmetic of her own about how much time was truly left and what, if anything, could still be done with it. Caleb hadn't moved through any of it, not when Kilo came through the door, not when the judge spoke, not when Grace stood up and asked for time nobody expected her to ask for. He'd sat with his hands flat on his knees, exactly the way he had that first morning back in his own kitchen, watching a dog he hadn't seen in 18 months fail, in front of everyone, to be what everyone needed him to be. His breathing had gone shallow, quick, the kind of breathing Denise recognized from nights when a bad dream chased him halfway into the hallway before he woke. She reached for his hand under the table, and for once he let her hold it, his fingers cold and small inside hers. She could feel his pulse there, fast against her palm, faster than she'd ever felt it. 1 minute left. Somewhere at the back of the room a phone buzzed against someone's leg and was silenced fast, apologetically. Prescott glanced toward the clock himself now, openly, the small tell of a man whose patience, however fair-minded, was a finite resource, being spent down to nothing. Then, with less than a minute left on a clock nobody had said out loud, Caleb Torrance stood up out of his chair. Denise reached for his sleeve and missed. Grace turned. The bailiff took half a step forward and then stopped, uncertain, because nothing about the small, silent boy walking calmly toward the center of the courtroom looked like it needed to be stopped. No one in the room moved fast enough to stop him. Caleb crossed the last few feet of courtroom floor and knelt down in front of Kilo, close enough that the dog's low, uncertain head was almost level with his own. Behind him he could hear his aunt's chair scrape as she half rose and then stopped herself, could feel Grace Polino's stillness, could feel the whole room holding its breath, the way a held breath presses on the back of the neck. For 11 months he had believed that saying it out loud would use it up, that the signal was a piece of his father he could only keep by never spending it, the way you don't touch a wound you're afraid won't heal right if you press on it. Kneeling there, with a stranger's judge 3 minutes from a decision and his aunt's whole future folded into what happened next, he understood, all at once and without anyone explaining it to him, that he had it backward. Saying it wouldn't lose his father, it was the only way to keep him. He reached out and tapped 2 fingers against his own knee, twice. A pause, held just long enough that the whole courtroom seemed to hold it with him, once more. Then he pursed his lips and let out a whistle so soft it barely disturbed the silence in the room. The exact shape of air his father had taught him on a training field 18 months and a lifetime ago. Kilo's head came up. It happened faster than anyone in that room was prepared for. The ears that had been pinned back snapped forward. The tail that had hung low went rigid. Kilo rose out of his low, uncertain stance into a posture none of them had seen from him all morning, spine straight, chest forward, eyes locked on Caleb's face with an intensity that had nothing left in it of an old dog confused by fluorescent lights and strangers. It was the exact stance from the photograph in Denise's purse. It was the exact stance from a training field 18 months ago that only 2 people had ever witnessed. Somewhere behind Denise, a woman in the gallery made a small sound and pressed a hand to her mouth. Even the bailiff by the door had gone still, watching. Colonel Reyes, still crouched a few feet away, let his own hand fall from Kilo's flank, no longer needed. "Your Honor." Colonel Reyes was on his feet, voice carrying clean across the courtroom. "That signal is not standard training. It does not appear in any official record for this animal. Master Sergeant Torrance developed it privately, off the books, and to my knowledge it has never been performed for anyone but his son. What you just witnessed cannot be replicated by a stranger or a coincidence." Grace Polino rose next, and her voice, when it came, had none of the careful procedural distance from 5 days earlier. "Your Honor, I've spent a career reading files that tell me what's true. I've just watched something a file can't write down. I'd ask the court to weigh it accordingly." Judge Prescott sat without moving for what felt, to Denise, like the longest silence of her entire life. He looked at the boy kneeling on his courtroom floor, with one hand still resting against a dog, standing at rigid, devoted attention. He looked at the affidavit, and at Colonel Reyes still on his feet, and at Grace Polino, who had spent the whole hearing arguing procedure, and was now arguing something else entirely. He took his glasses off, folded them once, and set them on the bench in front of him, as if he needed his own eyes unobstructed for whatever he was about to say. "In 22 years on this bench," he said finally, "I've had a great many things put in front of me as evidence. I don't recall many that argued their own case quite this plainly." He looked at Caleb a moment longer, and something in his face, briefly, was not a judge's face at all, but simply a man's. Then he reached for his gavel. "The temporary relocation order is vacated," he said. "Guardianship remains with Miss Okafor, effective immediately, pending only the standard home study, which I expect will be a formality given what this court has just observed." The gavel came down once, and the sound of it seemed to release something that had been held tight in the room for 5 days straight. Denise was out of her chair before she knew she'd moved, crossing the courtroom floor to drop to her knees beside Caleb, pulling him and the dog both into her arms at the same time, all three of them tangled together in the middle of a room full of strangers who had for one unguarded minute stopped being strangers at all. Kilo pressed his head against Caleb's shoulder and stayed there, unmoving, as if he had finally found the one thing in the building worth standing still for. Somewhere behind them, someone in the gallery began, quietly, to clap, and a few others followed, an unpolished ripple of sound that no one in the room seemed embarrassed by. Nobody said anything to Caleb. There was nothing left that needed saying. 3 weeks later, there was a dog bed by the front door that hadn't been there before, and a leash hanging on the same hook as Caleb's backpack. Denise sat on the kitchen floor, with Wyatt's old box open in front of her one last time. She added a new photograph to the ones already inside, Caleb, herself, and Kilo standing outside the courthouse, all three of them caught mid-laugh, nobody posing for it. She left the box open a moment longer than she needed to. On the refrigerator, where a brown envelope had once hung like a countdown, there was a different envelope now, a confirmation of permanent guardianship, official, signed, unremarkable in every way except what it meant. Caleb sat on the floor with Kilo's head heavy across his lap, one hand resting on the dog's back, the other tracing the edge of the new photograph. "His name was Wyatt," he said, out loud, clearly, without his voice breaking on it. "He was my dad." Denise knelt beside them both, watching the late afternoon sun come through the window and settle warm across the floor, across the dog, across the boy who had finally stopped bracing. Kilo's tail thumped once against the floor, and that was answer enough.